Hey everyone, it's Natalie, and I want to talk to you about how I kind of make decisions around risk sometimes with some of the trips that I do. If you don't actually know me or haven't worked with me before, so I've been a guide since 2002 on and off, so for over 20 years. I currently teach wilderness medical courses where I actually do instruct people a bit in how to structure and think about risk. I work for the U.S. Antarctic program doing field safety and have worked being in charge of the sea ice as well as going on traverses. So I basically spend a lot of time really thinking about risk in high consequence situations. But there's a story for why I decided I want to talk about this today. And it is because I was on a trip in Colorado, just a short one, and went to go do a 14er by myself, and someone called me out on the trail about my risk around mountain lions. And it caught me off guard. And then, of course, you know what happens when you have weird interactions with people is that you always think of all the right things to say later. One of the things that I think is super important about how we think about risk is probability versus consequence. So the probability being with risk that there's going to be there's a risk that something goes wrong, and then, you know, how high is that chance versus what's the consequence of if that goes wrong, then what do we suffer as an outcome? So the categories that are really simple are the extreme ends of that spectrum. So if you have something that is low probability and low consequence, it's low probability on a cement path that happens to be a trail in one of our national parks that I'm actually going to roll an ankle because it's a completely smooth path. And also the consequence is very low. It's not life-threatening. I'm able to be around other people if there's pavement and resources to get me out, to get me to help. And the help is just your primary care doctor. Not a big deal. And on the other end of that spectrum are the very obviously bad things, all right? The example I like to use is near a waterfall in one of our national parks, near the Grand Canyon. We don't go all the way to the edge of the waterfall, step like in the moving, raging water, and try to balance so we don't fall off the edge, because it's just very high risk and very high consequence. We can see that we would be swept away, and we can see that the fall is hundreds of feet. I want to say that some people haven't done some of these things, in particular, all for the gram, but most of us just wouldn't. We can kind of see it's high risk, high consequence. And the consequence being, when we really think about high consequence, we're thinking about obviously death, but also just like significant traumas, a chance of having, you know, irreparable harm done to yourself. So that category tends to be really simple. We perceive it, and many of us, just as a human nature for self-preservation and evolution, we just don't want to engage in that. So then we have the two other categories. So an example of something in the yellow is where you have something that is maybe high probability but low consequence, and so we don't take a lot of care to deal with it, and sometimes that bites us in the butt. A great example of this is blisters. Wouldn't it have been great if we knew that the chance was so high, we just prevented it from happening? But at least at a minimum, in risk management decision making, something that has low consequence at least doesn't kind of lead us into these emergencies or things that are high consequence. And so the most scary category is something that is low probability but does actually have a high consequence. Because in these cases, rather than dangling off of the edge of that waterfall, you might have decided that, you know, you didn't like the picture by the barricade, so you wanted to step over the barricade. And you wanted to be closer and a little bit more like in nature for your photo. Now, you're not standing in the raging water, you're not dangling off of the edge, but you're moving yourself closer to that hazard, and the consequence is still quite high. The consequence is still that if you fall those hundreds of feet on the waterfall, you're not going to make it on the back end. But the probability is pretty low. Like, what's the chances on flat ground you're going to fall? You know, but then you have to start adding in the element of variables that are sometimes hard to calculate. What's the chances that you might slip on granite rock, which happens to be kind of a more slippery rock? And then what are the chances if it's uneven terrain and it's also been water polished because it's near the waterfall. Or let's say it maybe gets splashed here and there by the water in the waterfall. So now it's far more slick than you're anticipating. And you've moved yourself into a zone where you actually have real potential to fall. You know, the barricade is there because it's literally creating a barrier so that there is no chance of falling over. Then there's no consequence that's, you know, not worth taking. But we cross these lines into these yellows, but it's like, well, you're just not going to fall. But the consequence is unacceptable if you do, and there's nothing done to mitigate the risk. And so when I talk about it in wilderness medical courses, or even every day that I'm out guiding, it's, are we ever engaging in something where there's a consequence that could be potentially not something acceptable? And if so, are we going to, you know, is there a way to avoid it completely? And if there's not a way to avoid it or change it or move around it, what are we going to do to potentially make that consequence more acceptable? You know, people do this all the time when they choose to potentially add a rope and a backup in a system where the consequences of falling would be otherwise unacceptable. So, all of that being said, I encountered a gentleman. Love it when you have lovely gentlemen telling you their opinions about what you're doing outside. And I was hiking down the mountain. I was actually probably 10 minutes back from the car, having finished summited 2 14ers and, you know, clearing out early. It was before 12 o'clock in the morning. I left really early because there were thunderstorms. The thunderstorm chance at one point for the day was listed at starting at 80%, going to 80%. And it's Colorado. Many of us are aware that Colorado is just notorious for having thunderstorms every afternoon. And the storm systems, even the night driving to get to this trailhead, I encountered flash flooding that was coming off of the mountains I was going to hike into from thunder and lightning and massive rain cells that lasted all afternoon into the evening till 10 p.m. So very real, very high chance that there will be thunder, lightning, and if that isn't enough when you're in the mountains, like, we can all just understand that you don't want to be at the top of the mountain in that. There's also the actual risk of, with that much rain, every creek crossing that I do on that trail may become completely impassable for however long it lasts while it's flooding, and I'm trapped on the other side with just my day equipment. So that's what I'm battling. I got up and started hiking at 2 in the morning. And this gentleman, when he found out I left at 2 in the morning by myself on this trail and hiked alone for hours in the dark, was just like, whoa, even I don't do that. There are mountain lions. And it's true. There are mountain lions. I thought about that too. Now, the consequence of getting eaten by a mountain lion sounds also quite bad. Don't really want that. But how do we judge the possibility of that? All right. It is always like, it's possible. It's possible that today's my day that the mountain lion eats me. And I should really consider that. And there are things that actually matter to me when it comes to behaviors of some of our wild animals, like how close are they to big populations, how much land do they have to roam and be in, how much food sources do they have, because their behavior changes when they get land pressed and when they're in scarcity with food. And some of the encounters that we have that are negative are when the animals have a lot of those pressures. So you see issues with mountain lions around the LA area because we've essentially pressed up into their territories and they actually don't have enough space for all of the mountain lions to roam and get the food that they need. I would never hike there at 2 in the morning. I think that the probability is much higher that I could have a bad encounter. That wasn't where I was at. I was in a very unpopulated county of Colorado, massive wide open spaces. I was in the Sangre de Cristos, if you've ever been there. There's elk, there's deer, there's tons of food. And so between those two risk factors, I had to take something that was possible, but like the possibility didn't seem that high to me. And having done a lot of solo hiking and having like spending a lot of time in the mountains all the time, I can tell you I just don't have bad encounters with mountain lions in most of our open wild spaces. So it's like, okay, there's a possibility of this that's immeasurable but low, and the consequence would be bad. And then there's this other thing that is almost, I mean, in my mind, 80% chance of thunderstorms, like it's gonna storm. It's gonna storm. Like there's 100% chance there's gonna be a thunderstorm today. How exactly bad, I don't know, but it was, you know, 1/4 of an inch plus more when actually raining, and it was flash flooding the day before. Like that risk is a high probability with a high consequence. And so sometimes with decision making, you have to have this hierarchy and then go, well, between the two, I want to manage my risk more for the thing I know is for sure going to be a problem. And that's what I did. I just left really early, like ridiculously early, and was down ridiculously early well before I even got a drop on me. And so that's where when this person called me out for having hiked in the dark, it was just like, I feel very good about that decision. I also did some other things, like I don't hike with earbuds in at night or in dawn or dusk so that I can hear what's going on around me, and I'm trying to be observant and even hear the animal calls. I mean, I try to be aware of my environment. That isn't a time to be shut off and tunnel vision any more than you are with just a headlamp. So anyway, that's my real answer. What I wanted to also say to this gentleman, and I will tell you, is that I have a trick for mountain lions, and it's called, I eat a lot of asparagus and garlic. And it turns out they must not really like that scent because they've just never bothered me. It's worked 100% of the time. I highly recommend it. So if you're worried, you can try that out as well.